Om Namo Narayana, Om Namah Shivaya, Shivam, Shivaham, Om. Welcome to another satsang with your host, Chuck the Yogi from the Yogi Cave. Where were we? Let's take a look. Let's see, I think it was the first two. So let's move along from there on to... I don't think I touched 1.2, and if I did, I should touch it again. Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the restriction of the fluctuations of consciousness. That bears repeating because yoga is, without a doubt, the foundation of yoga is the restriction of the fluctuations of consciousness in order to be able to see what lies underneath the surface. That is the foundation of yoga, no doubt. 1.3 Tada drashtuhu svarupe vastanam. Then the seer abides in its essence. That means that the self is alone with self, the small self, and the large self. Self with a capital S and self with a small s. Jiva and Shiva. Yoke, yoking, union. Yoga implies all of that. Being one with that higher power, being one with that something greater than oneself. That's what yoga is all about. 1.4 Vritti Sarupyam Itaratra. At other times there is conformity of the self with fluctuations of consciousness. That just means that when that's not happening, when there's not a state of coincidence of opposites, coincidencia oppositorum as Jung would say, then there's just normal consciousness. Ultimately, the yogi gets to a place where he's in that state all the time, 24/7, that state of oneness. But for the most part, people will experience normal states of consciousness, and one day they will be able to experience a state of continuous samadhi, like the motor will keep humming 24/7. But up to that point, there'll be ups and downs for the yogi. 1.5 Vrittayaha Panchattara Panchattayaha Klishta Aklishta. Fluctuations are fivefold: afflicted and unafflicted. So there's fluctuations that afflict the jiva, the person. There's fluctuations that are just a matter of course, things that you do to think about what are you going to do tomorrow and things of that nature. But Patanjali, being who he is, he's going to get into all that in 1.6. Brahmana Viparyaya Vikalpa Nidra Smritayaha. 5 types of fluctuations are valid cognition, misconception, conceptualization, sleep, and memory. So basically anything that a person experiences as consciousness can be understood as a fluctuation. 1.7 Pratyaksha Anumana Agamaha Pramanana. Valid cognition is based on perception, inference, and testimony. So Patanjali is very methodical. He enumerates the main forms of cognition, and then he gets into details of each one, starting with valid cognition, which is what we would call valid common sense, and it's based on perception, inference, and testimony of others. Common consensus of what this is or that is, or what have you, could be understood as valid cognition. So that's 1.7, 1.8, Viparyayo Mithya Janam Tadrupa Pratishtam. Misconception is erroneous knowledge not based on the actual appearance of that which is the underlying object. That just means that it's a misperception of any kind. So we have valid cognition, which is based on common sense or testimony or inference, and then we have misconception, which is the opposite. That would be the afflicted one, and common sense would be the non-afflicted form of consciousness. 1.9 Shabda Janna Anupati Vastu Shunyo Vikalpaha. Conceptualization is without perceivable object, following entirely verbal knowledge, which is kind of like the realm of philosophers and scientists, psychologists, and things of that nature, or people or disciplines of that nature, theologians that are playing with words and concepts and metaphors. That's what he's talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to have any basis in reality. The realm of philosophers and science fiction writers. 1.10 Abhava Pratyaya Alambana Vritil Nidra. Sleep is a fluctuation founded on the presented idea of non-occurrence. So that just means that sleep is a state of consciousness, but it's not a state of consciousness that is based on waking consciousness. So there's waking consciousness, and then there's sleeping consciousness. Waking consciousness is mainly beta and alpha, and then sleeping consciousness, delta, theta, and so on. So they're both valid forms of consciousness, but one is while waking, while awake, and the other one is while sleeping. 1.11 Anubhuta Vishaya Asampra Mokshaha Smritihi. Remembering is a non-deprivation of the experienced object. So that's simply a definition of memory well before philosophers and psychologists wanted to tackle that concept. Patanjali tackled that 2,000 years ago. It's simply a retrieval of information that's available to the mind. 1.12 Abhyasa Vairagya Pyam Dan Nirodha. Restriction of those fluctuations is achieved through practice and dispassion. So, the restriction of consciousness, which is what he talked about in the beginning, one of the prerequisites, or two of the prerequisites, is practice and dispassion. So dispassion, vairagya, is a non-interest in the achievement or non-grasping of the achievement or positive or negative of any given thing. It's simply detachment. And practice is, he'll get more into detail as to what practice or sadhana means. But those are the two columns on which yoga is based in order to achieve that restriction. And restriction of consciousness is just a preamble to what yoga is supposed to be. It's simply a prerequisite in order to achieve that. 1.13 Tatra sti tao yatno yasaha. Practice is the exertion in gaining stability in that state of restriction. So therefore, anything that helps to achieve that state of restriction is considered practice, whether it's chanting mantras or focusing on a point in front of you or focusing on a yantra or an image of any kind. Anything that helps you to achieve that restriction is considered practice. So I'm not going to get into 1.14 because that's a mouthful. So let's just kind of leave it here for now. Om Namo Narayana, Om Namah Shivaya, Shivam, Shivoham, Om, Jai Ma. Until next time.